Homer couldn't make up his mind about it. A lot of people seem to be in two minds about violence, especially political violence. The ecologist Andreas Malm was one of the people involved in the action against Swaraj Pump. He's been an environmentalist since the early 90s, literally longer than I've been alive. In that time, millions of people have gone on marches, millions of children have taken part in school strikes for climate, there's been letter-writing campaigns and extinction rebellion, and with the exception of the Unabomber and a few others, all of that's been completely non-violent. Malm and others say that's pretty remarkable. It is strange and striking that climate change activists have not committed any acts of terrorism. After all, terrorism is, for the individual, by far the modern world's most effective form of political action, and climate change is an issue about which people feel just as strongly as about, say, animal rights. This is especially noticeable when you bear in mind the ease of things like blowing up petrol stations or vandalizing SUVs. In cities, SUVs are loathed by almost everyone except the people who drive them, and in a city the size of London, a few dozen people could, in a short space of time, make the ownership of these cars effectively impossible just by running keys down the side of them at a cost to the owner of several £1,000s a time. Say, 50 people vandalizing 4 cars each every night for a month, that's 6,000 trashed SUVs in a month, and the Chelsea tractors would soon be disappearing from our streets, so why don't these things happen? Malm also says that this inspiring tradition of non-violence has failed. In my lifetime, CO2 emissions have accelerated, and there is now more money being invested in fossil fuel infrastructure. If civilization as we know it is to survive, those investments need to be written off. That means there needs to be no more fossil fuel infrastructure commissioned, and some of what we've already got needs to be dismantled. Malm says the free market ain't going to do that because investors expect profit, and governments have so far been reluctant to make the first move. So Malm, and here I must stress that the views of Dr. Malm are not necessarily the views of Philosophy Tube, free speech, academic cancel culture, turn around, touch the ground, skin cheese. Malm explicitly recommends sabotage. Massiven kriminellen Gewalttaten! As the Ende Gelände slogan puts it, we are the investment risk. At what point do we escalate? When do we conclude that the time has come to also try something different? When do we start physically attacking the things that consume our planet and destroy them with our own hands? Is there a good reason we have waited this long? Greta Thunberg turning up at COP27 like, right, motherfuckers! To be clear, Malm doesn't want violence against people. He advocates targeted sabotage of fossil fuel-emitting devices like SUVs and power plants as part of a mass movement that remains overwhelmingly non-violent. So he doesn't want guillotines. But he does want people to consider moving from protest to direct action. Given that the vast majority of environmental action is non-violent, a lot of people obviously find that idea a little bit too spicy. It's one thing to express yourself by going on a march, it's another to actually try and do something about it. Some environmental movements, including Extinction Rebellion and Ende Gelände in 2016, explicitly rule out the kind of thing that Malm thinks is necessary. He and others say this ruling out of direct action often ignores the history of it working. People remember MLK, they ignore the Black Panthers. They remember Gandhi, they ignore the Indian Mutiny. They remember the suffragettes, but they ignore the suffragettes who planted bombs and threw rocks at Winston Churchill. Can you imagine the reaction you would get throwing stones even at the statue of Winston Churchill now? We wouldn't need nuclear energy. We could power the whole country on the fury of telegraph columnists. And I include myself here. The Stonewall riot was one of the catalysts for LGBT rights in the English-speaking world, and it wasn't peaceful. Police turned up at the Stonewall Inn in New York and started systematically rounding up and sexually assaulting trans and gay people. So they defended themselves. They threw loose change and then bricks at the police. I'm glad they did that. My life is almost certainly better as a result. And yet, I have political goals now, things that would make my life better again, and I'm not using those kinds of tactics to pursue them. Now, you might say, Abigail, that's because you're a hypocrite. and a coward, and you'd rather lie around in a hammock eating French cheese than get off your ass and actually try and do something. And I'd say, well, I don't think that's entirely fair. It's not a hammock, it's a divan. But this is Philosophy Tube. And on this show, we know that the interesting intellectual and emotional stuff comes out when people try to defend the tensions in what they think. So, why do so many people have this discomfort, almost hypocrisy, around violence? Maybe what we need is a clear-cut case to sharpen our critical skills. So, let's take it to the extreme. Let's talk about guillotines. France in the 19th century was an absolute monarchy. That's a political system in which the monarch is not bound by any written law, so they have a right to do anything you can't stop them from doing. They had a lot of debt, and poor people paid more taxes than rich people because rich people wrote all the laws. And rich people had so captured the state that meaningful reform just wasn't happening. Plus ça change, plus ça même chose. The people of France decided they'd had enough, so they wrote strongly worded letters and held peaceful protests until the people in charge felt so bad they changed their ways. I'm just kidding, they cut the king's goddamn head off. And almost immediately, several European politicians and philosophers shit their fucking pants. But one man could always be relied upon to keep his pants firmly unshitted, and that was Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant wrote a lot of famous books like The Critique of Pure Reason, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, Harry Potter and the Metaphysics of Justice, all of which philosophy students will know. But today I want to look at some of his lesser-known albums, his later stuff, his B-sides, because Kant actually lived through the French Revolution. I say lived through, he never actually went to France, but he read about it on 19th century Twitter. And he had some thoughts that have puzzled philosophers since, because even Kant had some seemingly contradictory ideas about political violence. On the one hand, Kant was an enthusiastic supporter of the revolutionary cause, so much so that he acquired the nickname the Old Jacobin. The Jacobins were the more radical wing of the revolution. When things first got going, it looked like France might become a constitutional monarchy, like Britain, where you keep the monarch, but they have to follow some laws. And the Jacobins were like, oh, well, une monarchie constitutionnelle, mais que diriez-vous à la place? La guillotine. And eventually they won. Kant thought republicanism was great, the most rational form of government. On the other hand, he condemned killing the king and any kind of violence and even breaking the law. He was very explicit about that. All resistance against the supreme legislative power, all incitement of the subject to violent expressions of discontent, all defiance which breaks out into rebellion is the greatest and most punishable crime in a commonwealth, for it destroys its very foundations. This prohibition is absolute. And even if the power of the state or its agent, the head of state, has violated the original contract by authorizing the government to act tyrannically, and has thereby, in the eyes of the subject, forfeited the right to legislate, the subject is still not entitled to offer counter-resistance. And philosophers since Kant have tried to figure out how he squared these two apparently contradictory ideas, liking the French Revolution, but opposing the French Revolution. Kant was quite into what philosophers call social contract theory. It was really big in the Enlightenment. There's lots of different versions, but the basic idea is, imagine a time before society called the state of nature, where there are no laws. It's not a real time like the Dark Ages or the Roman Empire. It's a rhetorical figure, like the age of heroes or the time of gods and monsters. In the state of nature, everybody has authority over themselves. So in that sense, they have a certain freedom. But because people's interests conflict, everybody's fighting all the time. So they come together and they transfer their individual authority to a government so they can decide what to do when people's interests conflict. That way we replace violence with politics. In return, the government might promise to do some stuff like follow the law, depends which version of the theory